Hello everyone, this is Tom in Los Angeles. I hope you're doing well. Today is May the 6th, 2021, and we are almost exactly 5 months from when this crazy project has started. It was actually the 3rd of December 2020 when I uploaded my first video about Canto number 1 of Inferno. And I just wanted to thank all the people who've been keeping me company in this journey, because it's been, so far at least, a fantastic journey for me. And the experience of sharing Inferno with all of you has been 100 times better than just reading it or rereading it by myself. So thank you very much. I'm also really excited today because I'm going to talk about not only the last canto of Inferno, Canto 34, but together with Dante, who's my favorite author, my second favorite author probably ever, who is Arthur Clarke. And so I have reasons to be particularly excited. And the reasons why I'm going to mention Arthur Clarke, who is not the first name that comes to anybody's mind when thinking about Inferno, is because he was a great scientist, and in one of his novels he described a phenomenon that happens almost exactly in the same way in his novel that happens in Canto 34. So let's get into the canto. First, I would like to make it clear that we can consider the supreme high note of Inferno probably Canto 33. That's where the infernal intensity and the horror of all Inferno comes to a real peak with Conto Ugolino. It's not only my opinion, but others have found this before. Canto 34 has, of course, the introduction to the host of all this party, who's Lucifer, but it also has a long logistical phase because it's a conclusive canto, and Dante wanted to perfectly conclude a perfect cantica. So in terms of intensity, I would say, and it's subjective surely, that Canto 33 is more intense than 34. However, the impression of having visually in front of us this massive monster of Lucifer is something really stunning. We could say that the real strength of Canto 34 is in the second part rather than in the first part, even if Lucifer appears in the first part, because of how original and unforgettable the physical descriptions of Dante and Virgil through the center of the earth and inside their underground journey are, and how Dante actually depicted them. As a reminder, we are in the fourth area of Cossito, which is the most internal one, which is called Giudecca, and it takes its name from Judas Iscariot, the famous betrayer of Jesus Christ, who really figures as the worst sinner in Inferno. Something that is striking and different about this particular area is that Dante and Virgil have no interactions with any condemned souls, and even less with Lucifer, who is presented as almost an inanimate and cold machine. We look at him almost as a massive Luna Park attraction, a terrifying one, but there is nothing interactive about him. And some commentators have fairly said that this is true of most, if not all, the demons that we found in Inferno, from Cerberus to Pluto, etc., etc. The real hell, the reality of hell, is inside the human beings, and the real horrors are in our soul rather than in these imaginary monsters. The first line of the canto is the only full verse in Inferno that is completely in Latin, and it says Vexilla regis prodeunt inferni. It's a derisive way for Dante to describe Lucifer, because they are, the translation is they are approaching the standards of the emperor or of the king. But these first three words of the sentence, Vexilla Regis Prodeunt, are taken literally from a famous hymn that was written in the 5th or 6th century. And it was famous and is still actually used in some celebrations in Italy and around the world. The fourth word, which is Inferni, is an addition by Dante. So it's almost a derisive joke that he's making, even though the original sentence is meant to celebrate Christ, the King, on the cross. In this case, with Inferni at the end, it's almost meant as a derisive celebration of Satan, who is there almost like a king. And Satan's position has been noticed that almost reminds us of somebody who's crucified. It's very dark in here, but what Dante thinks he sees in the distance is almost like a huge mill with big blades that are rotating. And that's obviously Lucifer in the distance. He feels a wind, a big wind, a cold wind coming, and so he protects himself behind Virgil. Something to note here is that he's protecting himself behind Virgil not as a gesture of fear, but simply because of the cold, because of this wind. He does admit that he is fearful at this point. He says, I find fear in myself, putting this in verse. But we know that this is already a kind of evolved and grown up Dante compared to 34 cantos ago. I love the visual of this type of lake of glass in Giudecca, where the condemned souls are completely encased in the transparent glass. So in the verse, Dante says, where the shades were covered wholly by ice, showing like straw in glass. So they're like straw caught in molten glass, if we think about an artisan shop in Dante's time, and how you could see they could already make these little items in glass with natural objects inside, and you could see them through. These condemned souls are positioned in many different ways, face up, face down, in different positions, but almost in a way that if we ever happen to find human remains in under all the ice of Antarctica, for example, Homo sapiens or Homo erectus, that's how they would potentially look like, encased in ice and conserved forever with this cold ice. Virgil and Dante get to the spot where where Lucifer is finally visible, and Virgil points him out to Dante, calling him Dis, which is the name that Virgil used in his Aeneid to call Lucifer. This was the classical name of Satan, and also this is the name that in the Jewish tradition was used to call Satan as well. Virgil calls Dante to be strong, to fortitude, and how chilled and faint I was on hearing that. You must not ask me, reader, I do not write it. Words would not suffice. Like every time we've noticed that Dante gets in a harder portion of the narration to believe, or harder to describe, he reaches out to us, he reaches out to the reader, almost like a master salesman. He's a master salesman, and like all master salesmen, he is able in these particular conjunctures to connect. He tries to connect more personally with us. Just like think about being in a bazaar and the seller sees that he's almost losing you, you're losing interest, and so he will put his hand around your shoulder and make it much more personal with you. That's how I feel Dante is acting right now here. Words would not suffice, my dear reader. I neither died nor kept alive. This comment is very important, in fact, because it's a way for Dante to say that to explain the spiritual moment where he is at right now. He is very close to a type of fundamental conversion, and he's saying, I'm almost half dead and half alive at this point. It's not just a facetious way to say he was scared. It's in fact a way for him to say, probably, that his fear of hell is now in this moment turning into fear of God, and that the old Dante with all of his ancient sins, is now dead, and someone else, something else is coming out of him. In fact, we will understand that very well in the next canto, the first of Purgatorio, with the rite of purification that he's going to go through. Dante spends a couple of terzine describing the size, the huge size of Lucifer, and we can understand here how massive he must have looked to him, because compared to the previous giants, a giant's height and mine would have provided closer comparison than with the size of his arm and the giant. So a giant compared to Lucifer's arm were more disproportionate. Therefore, he says, envision the whole that is proportionate to parts like this to understand how massive Lucifer is. And something that we sometimes tend to forget is that Lucifer, and it's in the root of his name, which means bringer or bearer of light, was the most magnificent of all of God's angels. That in itself, in the ancient myth, makes us understand a lot about this myth, which is in many ways predating Christianity. The fact that the preferred, the most handsome, the strongest one of all angels, or within the court, is sinning with pride and convincing himself of being more powerful than he is, and rebelling against the king, against the emperor, and ending up worse than anybody else. There's been a pretty fierce debate about the colors of the three faces of Satan. One particular comment about the three faces is that the physiognomy of Lucifer's face, with these three different mouths, 6 eyes, etc., is something that Dante did not invent by himself. In fact, it was one of the various depictions of Satan that was popular at the time. In particular, one of these depictions is found, and was found at the time of Dante, in the famous Battistero in Florence. And many say that that's what Dante kept seeing in his role as priore in Florence, when he was going to the Battistero for baptisms, etc. So it's not surprising that Lucifer looks like this in his Inferno. The three colors have ignited a lot of debate. Some people, even the most ancient commentators 700 years ago, said that the color red stands for anger, the color yellow stands for something like envy or jealousy, and the color black for ignorance. And this would be the three main characteristics of Satan, compared to the main three virtues on the opposite side in heaven. In this Judaica, together with Judas, are punished all the traitors to the benefactors, the traitors to the Lord, and for, in a broader sense, the emperor and the king. So we completely understand why Judas is here, and he is the only one of the three condemned souls whose head is being munched in the mouth of Satan, and he's also being flayed to add an additional degree of pain to his punishment, because he's the worst of the worst. And we have Brutus and Cassius, who are being munched, constantly munched by Lucifer in the other two mouths. And as Dante says, with their heads down, the black mouth holds the shade of Brutus. Not a word will he scream. Cassius is the sinewy one on the other side. So we also understand why they're there. They both betrayed Julius Caesar, who was the very first ruler of the empire, and there was a certain divine meaning in his role as first emperor. So Dante, who was of course a lover of the concept of empire from a political point of view, a supporter, and he loved the Roman Empire for many reasons, and obviously as a Christian he compares the sin of Judas from a spiritual point of view on the church side to the one of Brutus and Cassius from the political point of view. Now, here we get to the logistical part of the canto, where that probably stronger part of the canto as well. We know that up to verse 70, which is exactly a half point of the canto, the time that Dante and Virgil took to walk in their journey from the dark woods until here has been 24 hours. And we are right now at 6 p.m. of Saturday, the 26th of March, 1300, which is the Saturday of Easter weekend. So we know that because Dante has been giving us hints about the time that are very precise. From this moment until the end of Canto 34, there's going to be 24 more hours. So now what happens is that Virgil takes the initiative. As soon as the huge wings of Lucifer are open, he jumps on his body, on his hairy and frozen body, full of icicles and pieces of ice, and asks Dante to follow him and to lean on his body. Virgil will be carrying Dante's body. What they're doing is climbing down Satan's huge body, as if it was a tower almost, in the narrow space between the cliff where Cogito ends and then Satan's body starts. There is a space where Virgil and Dante are now climbing down. And there are two very important points to make here. The first one is a spiritual one. Dante is reaching the center of the earth, which in his astronomical world is not only the center of the world, but the center of the entire universe. That's basically at the waist of Lucifer. That's the center of gravity of the entire world. And once they reach that point, they will have a 180 degrees turn, because they will be on the other hemisphere. And so he's playing with gravity in a way that is absolutely shocking, thinking about the type of science they had or they actually lacked in his times. That in itself I find amazing. From a spiritual point of view, here Dante is making a metaphor to describe his actual conversion. In fact, conversion from the etymology of the world does mean twisting, a movement that is internal, of course, a movement of the heart, a movement of the soul. And to be clear, this is not just the description of any type of moral conversion, but Dante is graphically or visually reinstating the actual position of man where he was originally positioned. When man was in Eden, in the Garden of Eden, he was on this other hemisphere where Dante is. All humanity in the world of the Divine Comedy is now on the other side, on this side, on top of Inferno. And when Dante flips over, heads up, let's say, he will be the only man who is put right with the head upward towards the Garden of Eden, in the right position where Adam and Eve were put originally by God. To be clearer, Satan fell from heaven when he was kicked out from God, and he crashed into earth. There was on the other side of where it is today. All the people, all of humanity was all on the other hemisphere, the southern hemisphere of where it is today. To flee from Satan, all the land retracted and changed hemisphere. This is why on the southern hemisphere, where Dante is moving to and where the mountain of purgatory is, everything is covered in water, while the land is on the other side. So it's almost as if in Dante's universe, everybody, all the people, the living people, are all living head down, with their head feet up and head down. There is a water hemisphere and the Mount of Purgatory in the water hemisphere, with the Garden of Eden on top, and then the heavens and the circles of heaven on top of that. You might be wondering at this time, what does Arthur C. Clarke the famous British science fiction author, have to do with all this? It does have a lot to do with this, because right here at verse 80, Dante says, Virgil grappled the hair as someone climbing would, so I supposed we were heading back to hell. Cling tight, for it is stairs like this which we must scale to part from so much evil. Then he came up through a split stone and placed me on his sill and climbed toward me with his cautious step. I raised my eyes, expecting I would see Lucifer as I left him, and saw his shape inverted, with his legs held upward. What does it mean? It means that they have gone through the center of gravity, they have done a 180 in terms of their own body, and so Dante is completely confused. He thinks that they've gone back to hell. He's expecting to be again where Satan's waist is, and he's expecting to look up and see Satan's upper body. But that's not the case. They've gone through, and all he can see is Lucifer's two legs coming up from the ground, which for them at this point is the convex surface of Cocytus on the other side. So they are now in a location, in a place, which is basically a space, a cave, if we want to call it that, between the convex surface of Cocytus, which is the inverted side of Cocytus, and the underbelly of Earth on this side of the hemisphere. And that's amazing, because Dante is writing something that has never been written before. This inspired me and triggered a lot of memories in me. One of my very favorite novels by my favorite science fiction author, Arthur C. Clarke, is Rendezvous with Rama. And if you haven't read it, or if you don't know the novel, it's the plot is quite simple. It's about an unidentified object that at a certain point in our present history enters our solar system. And our systems recognize it as something that is not natural in the moment when they realize that it has a perfectly cylindrical shape. Arthur C. Clarke always had this love for something, for geometrical shapes alluding to intelligence, and he's always loved the concept of alien intelligence. So this is probably an alien this artifact, this huge cylinder in space, and there's a mission that is sent to explore it. This mission lands on the outside surface of this big cylinder, and the cylinder is rotating. Now, to make a long story short, the cylinder turns out to be empty inside, and because it's so big and is rotating constantly in space, the centrifugal force is creating an artificial gravity on the inside walls of the cylinder, therefore allowing for an actual civilization to live and prosper on the inside curved walls of this cylinder. A mind-blowing concept, right? At the same time, there is a memorable scene at the very beginning of the exploration of this cylinder by the astronauts, the human astronauts, where they managed to enter the cylinder from the point which is exactly at the center of the circle, which is one of the two bases of the cylinder. They enter through there, and once they are inside, they find three stairways that go out like the radius of the circle. They pick one and they start climbing this stair towards the inside wall of the cylinder. And in this case, I'm going to show a beautiful edition of Rendezvous with Rama that I have here. We have the cylinder, etc. In this case, we can see how the astronauts end up doing exactly the type of movement that Virgil and Dante do at the center of Earth. While they're climbing in a certain direction with their bodies positioned in a certain way, they have to flip 180 degrees in the moment where the gravity is starting to produce and generate weight from their body. See how similar some sentences sound. And now Karl Mercer told himself, I have to make my first decision. Am I going up the ladder or down it? At around 200 rungs, he noticed the first distinct sensations of weight. The spin of Rama was starting to make itself felt. At rung 400, he estimated that his apparent weight was about 5 kilos. This was no problem, but it was now getting hard to pretend that he was climbing. When he was being firmly dragged upwards, he's going head up towards the inside wall of the cylinder, and he's feeling dragged and pulled towards it because of this centrifugal force. It's unbelievable because it's almost describing the same feelings that Virgil is feeling and how difficult it's for Virgil to do this 180 at the center of Earth. And we're now back at the final terzina of Inferno, which says, and following its path, we took no care to rest but climbed. We're still climbing. They're climbing up from underground. He first, then I. So far through a round aperture I saw appear. In Italian, this aperture verb or a term is pertugio. In the second last line, Dante says per un pertugio tondo, and this word pertugio was actually used in the previous canto to define the hole through which Ugolino was looking at the moon in the darkness. It's not a coincidence. Through a round aperture I saw appear some of the beautiful things that heaven bears, where we came forth and once more saw the stars. We are back outside from all this dirt and this dirtiness and this darkness. We have arrived at the foot of the Mount Purgatory, where Ulysses wanted to arrive and never did. It's, as I said in the beginning, it's been a real pleasure already so far, and I cannot wait to start climbing Mount Purgatory with you guys. Thank you very much again for all the company, the insight, the additional comments that you keep sharing with me. Please do keep sharing your thoughts or comments, and we'll keep going. There is a lot of time, and there is no hurry to go up Purgatory.